Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry. I'm a high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. All right, we're back with some simple history today, and I thought this would be an entertaining and interesting video to check out, and it's called Stereotypical Ways That Countries Fight Wars. So I know what we're going to see here when you have talking trees from Vietnam, Molotov cocktails from Russia, the United States blowing up stuff with ordnance that is way overkill. We'll see what they got. All right, the original video is down below. Make sure you're supporting Simple History. They're awesome. And let's get to it.
How different countries fight wars. When nations go to war, they employ all manner of doctrines that are believed to be the most efficient ways to ensure victory, whether based on economic, geographic, cultural, or other factors.
And I always thought that, like the Vietnam and stuff, those tunnel systems are just insane. Like, I don't care if you're not claustrophobic, but like, can you really operate like that? Oh.
Nations' methods for fighting wars have become well known and almost stereotypical, whether completely accurate or based on misconceptions.
Yeah.
Here are some ways that nations fight their wars.
So
the United States. When one imagines the United States...
Please appreciate this is America in one whatever picture this is supposed to be. This is it. Especially with the Uncle Sam just dropping, making it
going to war, thoughts immediately turn to high-tech military hardware, bringing copious amounts of firepower to bear against an overwhelmed enemy that has little chance against the onslaught.
Well, in the capitalistic system that the United States has that very much promotes and subsidizes military manufacturing, there are so many companies that can make a fortune off of innovating new technology because the United States pays top dollar when it comes to their military contracts. So it's a perfect blending for military technology in the United States.
But is this true? Well, in short, yes. In the 20th century, the U.S. has taken a much more active role in world affairs, and as a consequence has expended tremendous effort towards its military. As of 2023, the Americans spent $877 billion per year, more than the next 10 nations combined. This, along with extensive technological development, means that American forces have access to some of the most technologically advanced military hardware in the world. While not the largest in numerical terms, the U.S. military can bring more firepower to bear.
Is this a jab at the Chinese, the was a weather balloon or whatever last year? Where they sent like an F-15 or something. We sent a fighter plane to go and just launch rockets at this floating weather balloon.
At any given moment than any other nation. U.S. doctrine relies on power projection, the ability to fight sustained conflicts well outside the nation's borders. The centerpiece of this strategy is the large fleet of aircraft carriers. Of the 21 currently active aircraft carriers, 11 belong to the U.S. Navy, with the next nations with 2 each.
I mean, it basically means you can have an Air Force, an Army, whatever, but especially an Air Force anywhere in the planet, which is true.
On a modern battlefield, arguably the most decisive element is air superiority. In order to control the skies, the United States has access to a large number of aircraft, including strategic bombers, fifth-generation fighters, close air support to aid troops on the ground, cargo planes, reconnaissance and surveillance craft, among many others. Hey Simple History fans, with the vast digital world around us, I've been in search of a new browser that can not only streamline my workflow, but enhance my browsing experience. It's how I stumbled upon the new Opera desktop browser. Now here's the thing, I've got multiple interests.
The whole aircraft carrier thing, definitely like,
checking out Airbnb.
If you want to have, especially some offensive
tabs open,
right?
With Opera's tab islands, my life got
I don't know, with the United States, they can
get organized into these groups or
anywhere in the world.
So no more clutter. But hang on, you know how we use different messenger and music apps? Opera Desktop integrates them all. Spotify, Apple Music, WhatsApp, Telegram,
they're always ready to go, fueled up, got
and as for me, I value online privacy.
Get something somewhere.
Ad blocker are game changers. Now let's talk AI. Meet Aria, Opera's browser AI. Quickly highlight some text and Aria can explain, explore, or even translate it for me. That's pretty cool, right? Remember, it's not just about browsing, it's about enhanced, smooth, and efficient online experiences. Try out Opera Desktop for yourselves. Check out the link in the description to download Opera Desktop for free, and you'll see the difference for yourselves. Here's to a better browsing future. Because of this, there's an anecdote saying that the world's largest air force is the U.S. Air Force, and the second largest is the U.S. Navy. This isn't exactly true, however. The largest air force is in fact the U.S. Air Force. The second largest is the U.S. Army Aviation. The third largest is the Russian Air Force, with the U.S. Navy relegated to fourth place. The seventh place spot goes to the U.S. Marine Corps. In total, the American military can deploy over 13,000 aircraft, with the closest rival, the Russian Air Force, consisting of a bit over 4,000. In addition, the U.S. has over 750 military bases in 80 countries around the world, meaning American troops can respond to crises anywhere in just a few days. In recent decades, more and more emphasis has been placed on the use of unmanned drones, which enable the American...
Average Call of Duty gamer. I'm not gonna lie, I'm not too far off of this guy right here, okay?
Emphasis has been placed on the use of unmanned drones, which enable the American military to engage foes from hundreds or even thousands of miles away. A testament to the technological edge the U.S. has over many opponents. The key to American force projection is industry and logistics.
It's like we're to a point now to get actual human combat. Like, you have to go through multiple waves of military attacks and defense before you're going to actually see an American up close, right? With drones, with the planes, and incredible Air Force. If it gets down to like American troops on the ground within earshot and eyesight of an enemy, things got real if it got down to that.
The U.S. is geographically isolated from many hotspots around the world. Extensive logistic chains have been developed. Currently, the overwhelming majority of the military are involved in logistics and support duties rather than frontline service. Wherever Americans are deployed, they will have the necessary food, ammunition, fuel, and whatever else they need to complete their mission. American military spending enables the ability to utilize what's been dubbed shock and awe, a term that was developed during the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Foes are overwhelmed with immense firepower and cutting-edge hardware that's almost impossible to resist in a direct engagement. Wherever American soldiers are deployed, they will almost certainly have at their disposal some of the highest technological advancements available.
What's the whole, proportional response thing? Not in the U.S. military vocabulary. They just go all out. The first Gulf War was like that. It was so incredibly decisive early on that I don't know if we've seen a mismatch like that. But it depends on the type of war where that can actually be useful, because there's other times where technology isn't going to be as useful with that, and fighting some of that urban warfare and not fighting traditional enemies with battle lines, and be able to know from friend from foe and civilian from foe. That's where technology doesn't help you as much and becomes very difficult. That's why a lot of entanglements include that kind of warfare now.
Backed up by an extensive logistics chain that far outstrips virtually any
standard army is not going to defeat the United States like this.
Full power.
If you want to fight, it's just not going to.
Germany.
All right, Germans, what y'all got?
During both world wars, Germany began the conflict using rapid advances, earning them a reputation for blitzkrieg, or lightning war, though they never used that term in any official context. In both cases, however, the initial success
never did, huh? So where did that term come from? The blitzkrieg then? I thought it would have been something that was kind of discussed. It definitely would feel like that if you're on the other side of it. If you're being attacked, you're like, this feels like lightning warfare with the three-pronged invasion that is blitzkrieg.
Germany adopting a more defensive posture, digging in against Entente and Allied counteroffensives. During World War I, after the initial success of the Schlieffen Plan, the German army created an elaborate network of trenches, fortifying large stretches of the Western Front with layers of defenses.
Let me get you your extra history. So, Schlieffen Plan, the military plan that Germany already had, but had basically stowed away before World War I even started, basically said that if you were to fight a war with France or Russia, knowing that those countries would be allies, what would be the quickest way to defeat one of those sides to specifically avoid a two-front war? And the idea was that Russia would take a lot longer to mobilize than France would, so you do an all-out invasion of France and hopefully finish that before the Russians can fully mobilize. So then the next step of that would be what would be the most efficient way to infiltrate France and make France drop. And that was to go through Belgium, right? French-German border is a lot more difficult. It's fortified geographically. It's more difficult. So go through Belgium, right? And there's some problems with that. One is, what if Belgium is not part of the war and they're a neutral nation? Could that then bring in other countries, to fight and basically make Germany look good, look bad that way? But it came about like weighing those options. Is that a risk worth taking? And in the World War I instance, they said it was. Now, it did end up bringing Britain into the war immediately after that because they were allies with Belgium. But then also the fact that Schlieffen Plan failed, and the fact that Russia ended up mobilizing way faster than Germany thought, and a two-front war took place anyways.
After suffering heavy casualties in the early portion of the war, the German High Command developed a layered defense in depth. Called elastic defense, the doctrine called for allowing the enemy to attack, steadily increasing the intensity of resistance until the enemy was overextended, and then launching a counterattack which drove back the enemy while minimizing German casualties.
That's how trench warfare is in
During the Second World War, the Germans constructed an elaborate network.
It's a ladder. It's like rungs of a ladder. Someone pushes, and then you want to push them back and move rungs of the ladder.
In what were known as the Atlantic Wall along the Atlantic coast to repel any Allied
blockades and
invasion,
stuff,
and the Siegfried Line, which ran between the border of France and Germany.
Yeah.
The linchpin of both designs were defensive bunkers, fixed emplacements designed to withstand virtually anything the enemy could throw at them. They were usually made from reinforced concrete, which could be several feet thick,
Still see a lot of those bunkers
for machine guns, mortars, and other weaponry. They would be positioned in strategic locations, such as around towns and cities, advantageous locations around trench lines, and often on the reverse slope of a hill.
This is why there were so many doubts about the success of D-Day, because of the Atlantic Wall. I mean, Germany had fortified the whole northern European continent to such crazy levels that it took, such a logistically well-planned attack and a couple million troops that ended up getting staged there down in southern Britain. It took the biggest amphibious invasion ever. And even with that, there was a lot of doubts that D-Day was going to work because of that.
This did limit the range of the bunker's weaponry, but the advantage of surprise made up for the loss of range. A particularly well-enforced bunker or pillbox could withstand a direct hit from heavy artillery, and in later years, aerial bombardment. These bunkers were so well made that on numerous occasions, enemy forces would bypass them during their advance, leaving the bunkers and pillboxes as islands of resistance in a sea of foes. German forces also made use of small one-man fortified positions known as Tobruks after the Libyan city, which was the site of an important siege in the Second World War. These concrete structures were circular, allowing the occupant a 360-degree field of fire with his weaponry, usually a machine gun. Some Tobruks were open-topped, but there were other single-man bunkers which were capped with tank turrets, giving the occupant much greater protection. While rapid-moving mechanized forces may have received the most attention, it was the extensive defensive positions that Germany employed that was a key component to Germany's overall military strategy.
Amazing that it worked, huh?
China.
All right, what's the Chinese stereotype?
UN troops drove back the North Koreans from their southern neighbors. As they advanced north, they encountered Chinese soldiers who threw themselves at the enemy in a tidal wave of bodies, overwhelming them in sheer weight of numbers. Is this accurate, or a misunderstanding of Chinese tactics?
Yeah,
as one of the old
tactics, just throwing meat shields. Like, no, it's not tactic for anybody. Okay, not willingly, unless you're Joseph Stalin or something.
The civilizations on Earth, China has a long history of warfare against both internal and external threats.
Yes, it's
The
true.
Art of War by Sun Tzu is widely regarded as one of the first military manuals in the world that could be traced back to the 5th century BCE. Other innovations in military development have their origins in China, especially gunpowder, which has had arguably more of an impact than any other invention. Today, China
it completely changed warfare. It changed cannons are the reason why walls are no longer effective. And artillery is why we don't use so much. I mean, we saw this in World War I, but even before that, with cavalry charges and, ended even like whole, whatever you call it, like European Knights, like that whole mystique of that got ended because of gunpowder and stuff like that. It did
the second largest military.
It's almost like military technology did not change much in the history of the military, for like thousands of years until gunpowder came.
Like how much after the United States really and has the largest military in the world in terms of number and is extensively trained in combined arms, utilizing infantry, armored forces, air power, naval forces, and special operations units, as well as a large reserve of nuclear weapons should the need arise. So where did the idea of massive waves of conscripts charging the enemy, throwing...
I was wondering about that. Maybe is it because, just my thoughts before they talk about it, you know, so much of the military history too in China is from people fighting against their own state, meaning it's coming from peasants, you know what I mean, that are taking up arms and not in traditional military fashion. That's been so much of the military history of China.
Men at the enemy until they run out of ammunition come from. Well, for starters, China has a titanic population, and until early 2023, it was the most populated nation on the planet.
One-child policy.
1/5 of the world's population living in China, there is a pre-existing perception that they have manpower to spare, and are able to absorb casualties that would cripple other nations. The reputation of the Chinese forces using human wave tactics began during the Korean War. Chinese soldiers would mass against an enemy position and then attempt to overrun it with sheer weight of numbers. To those on the receiving end of such an assault, it seemed like endless waves of Chinese infantry were crashing towards them. In reality, Chinese tactics were much more sophisticated. Under the cover of darkness, infiltration teams would creep close to the enemy, and at a prearranged signal, such as a bugle or a gong, they would surge forward in an attempt to overrun the position using shock and violence of action. Should the action fail, however, another infiltration team would make their attempt, repeating the process, though without the element of surprise. While this was going on, other forces would attempt to slip around the enemy and attack from the rear. Due to poor communications, this process can be repeated over and over again, regardless of casualties, giving those who face it the impression that they're being assaulted by waves of Chinese troops. This was exacerbated by journalists reporting on the war, who wanted to give the impression of American and other UN forces being overwhelmed by hordes of enemy soldiers. Those who actually faced such tactics knew differently, with American soldiers remarking sardonically, "How many hordes are there in a Chinese platoon?"
Jeez.
Russia and the Soviet Union.
All right, what's the Russian stereotype going to be? Okay, it's not going to Soviet Union. All right, is it going to be meat shields? Like the Stalin era?
Russia and the Soviet Union was and is the largest nation on the planet, with vast expanses of territory. It's also home to a large population compared to other European powers. To their foes, such as the French during the Napoleonic era, or the Germans in the 20th century, fighting Russia or the Soviet Union was a never-ending trek through hostile environments, facing waves after waves of stubborn defenders, being ground down over time in a never-ending war of attrition.
The stereotype is draw in your enemy during the winter. Oh, and scorched earth. You get to bring up scorched earth with this.
But is this accurate? It is true that Russia is a titanic landmass, and invading the nation requires extensive logistics and marching over seemingly endless territory. In the words of Army Group South's commander Gerd von Rundstedt, the vastness of Russia devours us. Compounding the environmental issues were the weather conditions, such as deep mud in the autumn that can stop armies in their tracks, and later the severe winters that crippled virtually all invaders. While dealing with these conditions, they would be subject to swarms of Russian or Soviet soldiers who would overwhelm them with human wave attacks and the weight of seemingly endless numbers. This last part is not exactly accurate, however. In spite of Russia's landmass, the vast majority of the population and infrastructure lives west of the Ural Mountains.
Right, the European
Though
thing.
Impressive on a map, it is...
But, I mean, the reinforcements will come from the other side of the Urals, too. And those guys are not people you want to mess with. The dudes coming out of Siberia and crap that can fight in the Russian winter in their shorts and flip-flops.
Possible to withdraw the entire population, as well as vital infrastructure further east, though the Soviets did move many factories to these safer locations. During Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet Union faced a severe crisis, as
Operation Barbarossa is Germany's invasion of Russia in World War II.
Wehrmacht forces captured vast areas of territory, killing or capturing millions of Red Army soldiers. Joseph Stalin's infamous Order 227, nicknamed the Not One Step Back Order, issued in July 1942, demanded that Soviet forces stand their ground. To quote the order directly, every commander, every soldier and political officer has to realize that our resources are not infinite. Stalin then goes on to openly state that there is no way the Soviets could retreat endlessly, and that every bit of ground taken strengthens the enemy and weakens the Soviet war effort.
So much of Operation Barbarossa and the fight for Russia was over resources too. The Germans had to have it for them to continue their plans as they had. They're in southwestern Russia, again around Stalingrad. That's the oil-rich regions, and a major reason why they, deflected going away from Moscow and all that, and the heart of Russia that way to kind of detour, if you will, down to the southwest, was to do that. And then, of course, at a great cost that the Germans never recovered from. The war of resources is very real, and one that you have to win.
The bulk of the text explains why it was so important that they stand their ground and not continue to retreat deeper into Soviet territory. On the battlefield, Soviet soldiers were believed to throw themselves at the enemy in massive human waves, often without weapons. This is a gross misunderstanding.
Yeah, I've heard of that too. You hear that movies like Enemy at the Gates and stuff, where it's like, here's a box of bullets. There's no guns. Just rush and find a gun of a dead guy. I always had kind of been like, that's very Hollywood, right? Not to say that that didn't happen or happen anytime, anywhere, but
The Soviet doctrine is referred to as deep battle, which is similar to the German blitzkrieg, using massed frontal assaults to break enemy lines, penetrating deep into enemy territory.
Heavy machinery from Russians,
However, especially in the earlier stages of the war, the Soviets were on the defensive and suffered massive casualties. The Red Army was disorganized, especially in areas surrounded by the Wehrmacht, leading to uncoordinated assaults against prepared German positions.
Something interesting about German military leadership as well, by the time World War II hit, was that Stalin had purged like half of the military leadership as part of the Great Purge to consolidate power. Had done that in the 30s before the war had started, which left them without a lot of their experience that they could have had from World War I and
with limited communications and inexperienced officers and soldiers. Some of those who participated in the assaults were heavy weapon crews who often didn't have a secondary weapon, or NKVD troops armed only with pistols, which gave the impression of charging without weapons in the confusion of battle. These myths entered popular consciousness based on memoirs written after the war and reinforced by Hollywood movies which dramatized the false notion of endless waves of Russians and Soviets hurling themselves at the enemy without weapons. Vietnam.
Here we go.
It's all fun and games until the trees start speaking Vietnamese. When French and later American and other allied nations
Vietnam's history of just beating large powers. Right? China, they're always dealing with China going back for centuries. Then the European powers, Europe comes in and then have to fight the United States, just like they are the kings of defensive guerrilla warfare.
Over the tiny and impoverished nation of Indochina, later called Vietnam, they possessed some of the most advanced weaponry available at the time. Facing them were poorly equipped guerrilla fighters that somehow managed to halt world superpowers.
See, this is the stuff where where it can be the modern technology and whatever, it doesn't show itself, right? It doesn't show itself in this type of warfare.
The terrain of Vietnam is filled with dense jungles, rugged mountains, and expansive rice paddies that make travel difficult even under the best of circumstances. The Vietnamese who fought against foreign invaders took full advantage of this, moving quickly and quietly through the wilderness, appearing where they were least expected, striking at their enemies before melting back into the jungle with hardly any trace. Baffled Americans and others would ponderously trample after them without success. Aiding their ability to seemingly disappear into thin air was an extremely elaborate system of tunnels, some of which ran for miles underground and were rumored to be able to withstand direct hits from a B-52 strike. These underground facilities were elaborate, consisting of barracks, medical facilities, weapons storage, and manufacturing locations, and even cinemas and other entertainment venues. The entrances to these tunnels would be well hidden and virtually undetectable. Should they be discovered, collapsing them or stealing them was impossible, as the tunnel system was too extensive to be simply neutralized in this way. The only way to deal with these underground facilities was the unenviable task of tunnel rat, crawling into the dark, unknown spaces with a flashlight
Worst
and a
job
pistol.
in the war.
The Vietnamese also made
You
extensive
didn't
use
want to do that. It's also where you're going to have like flamethrowers and stuff, and just, you know, you just stick some barrel of a flamethrower down there and just roast anything in there.
booby traps, anything from punji pits to impale an unwary soldier's foot to tripwires attached to grenades or other explosives to any number of ingenious devices would force Americans and other enemies into a state of near constant paranoia. In a direct military engagement, Vietnamese forces would almost certainly lose. There was simply no way they could stand up to the massed firepower that can be brought to bear against them by their technologically superior foes. However, they didn't need to win a direct military engagement. Instead, their main focus was on time and morale. With each passing day, more American soldiers would arrive home in coffins or crippled for life, eroding American will to continue the conflict.
It's kind of like the American Revolution. You know, the longer that war went on, the more it helped the United States, because morale on the British side and support for the war on the British side is eventually going to run out, not going to get support from Parliament and stuff like that. Sometimes it's just surviving is the best way to win.
Even defeats would be turned into victories. In 1968, the Viet Cong and the NVA launched the Tet Offensive, a coordinated strike against American and South Vietnamese military installations around the country. The centerpiece of this would be an attack on the embassy in Saigon. Though this attack and the rest of the Tet Offensive was a disaster in military terms, it was ultimately a victory.
Exactly.
Seeing the American embassy violated in such a way, along with
that was the final straw. That was it. The war was already, you know, reaching a point where the American public is like, why are we still doing this? You know what I mean? And having that, remember, Vietnam War was also first war you could really get nightly updates with less filtering, right? And you know, it brought in this thing where it's like publications coming from the government or from the military were saying the war is going well and all this stuff. And even if the Tet Offensive brought more deaths to the enemy side or whatever, it's like that doesn't replace what you're seeing on the nightly news. You know what I mean? With Walter Cronkite. Like, it's like, I thought we were winning, but then you look over here and it's like the embassies are getting invaded and here's all these dead Americans and all that stuff. It was a strategic victory for the Vietnamese.
Daily images of the brutal fighting sapped the American public's willingness to continue with the conflict. In the end, the Vietnamese did not need to win a military victory, but rather a political one.
Yeah, exactly.
France.
Don't do the onions. Don't do the wave the flag thing. I hate it. I know it's a funny joke, but it's just jokes have to be rooted in truth.
Fortunate and completely false reputation of being a nation of cowards whose soldiers surrender at the first opportunity. In truth, however, the French have one of the most distinguished records in military history.
Yeah.
In the modern day, the French military utilizes the principles of speed, decentralized command, and precision strikes with small numbers of highly motivated troops. This doctrine is in stark contrast to the sledgehammer blows of other major world powers, such as their NATO allies, the United States. This was a deliberate response to the First and Second World Wars, where French troops stood toe-to-toe with their adversaries in direct force engagements, leading to catastrophic casualties. When French territory is potentially threatened, such as during the Cold War, French doctrine centered around the principle that good defense was a strong offense. Knowing that going toe-to-toe against a Warsaw Pact invasion would end in disaster, French planners relied on speed, mobility, and audacity, using aggression and violence of action in blitzkrieg-inspired strikes against the enemy. French sub-commanders were given a great deal of leeway to make decisions, and a culture of audacity of risk-taking was encouraged. This is designed to maintain the ability to act aggressively against threats while also remaining flexible to the ever-changing conditions on the battlefield, without having to ask for permission from a slow-moving chain of command. As a result, the French military prioritized quality over quantity, with a small number of troops able to strike with precision, rather than trade blows with the enemy in direct force-on-force engagements.
Still couldn't do it against Vietnam. They did the whole same thing, failed the same way.
The minimum amount of force necessary to complete the objective. In one example, in 2007, a large rebel advance in the Central African Republic was stopped in its tracks by around 100 troops and 2 fighter jets.
The engagements that France had in Africa, got to be talked about more. Like the Algerian War, if you've learned about the Algerian War, which was a French colony, the brutality of that war was insane.
This doctrine is very cost-effective, limiting the amount of resources spent on a particular engagement and reducing the number of potential casualties. By picking their battles and using their existing forces with surgical precision, the French military is able to hit far above its weight class and tie limited numbers to the highest degree possible. When nations go to war, they utilize a multitude of methods to win victory. Whether a stereotype or based in reality, there are as many ways to win as there are nations and cultures on the planet.
Each have got to find their own way and what works for them, right? All right, final thoughts here. So, no two countries are going to fight alike because no two countries are alike, right? The way Vietnam has to fight has to be different than the way the United States fights, right? And the countries that know themselves best are going to do well. It goes back to the Sun Tzu stuff, right? Okay, you have to know thyself, okay? Just like you have to know your enemy. You have to know thyself and thy enemy, otherwise you will lose. So yeah, interesting how just people can find success in a lot of different ways of fighting in the history of the military. So what are some other stereotypes out there of militaries out there? Let me know down in the comments. All right, guys, we'll see y'all next time. Bye.